Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, we will proceed into talking about how ordinary citizens get affected by emergency powers. This is important because when our country goes through a severe crisis, the government uses its emergency powers to handle the crisis. But their emergency power use can affect the day-to-day lives of all of us. Let's look at a historical instance of emergency powers being used by the federal government. By February 1917, World War I had been raging in Europe and the Middle East for 2.5 years, but most Americans had no interest in entering the war. The issues being fought over seemed confined to Europe, and it was rumored that battlefield conditions were dreadful. But soon, a coded telegram would surface. The first line read, quote, "We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare," unquote. Despite having run a re-election campaign with the slogan, quote, "He kept us out of war," unquote, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on the Central Powers. Congress agreed. Members adopted a resolution to go to war and passed several related laws. The Select Service Act required men in their 20s to register for the draft. The Espionage Act of 1917 made it criminal to obstruct the draft and to send unpatriotic materials through the mail. The Sedition Act of 1918 declared it a federal offense to use, quote, "disloyal, scurrilous, or abusive language," unquote, about the Constitution or the American government, flag, or military uniform. Most Americans quickly caught war fever. Patriotism was not merely important as it was a political and social imperative. However, some people continued to oppose America's involvement in this war. One such person was Eugene V. Debs. When he was 14, Debs dropped out of school to work on the railroads. The owners amassed fortunes while the laborers remained impoverished. Debs did not think that was right. He organized strikes against management to demand higher pay. Over time, he joined and led the Socialist Party of America. Socialists argued that there should be no private ownership or property. In 1912, Debs ran for president under the socialist banner, and more than 900,000 people voted for him. He said, quote, "Wars are like railroads. They are undertaken to benefit the wealthy, but are built and operated by the downtrodden," unquote. In Canton, Ohio, in June 1918, days after nearly 10,000 American soldiers were killed at a battle site in France, Debs said, quote, "Rulers have always taught and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourself slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice in declaring war," unquote. Debs understood that the government might consider his speech disloyal, and he was careful not to directly urge the crowd to rebel or resist conspiration. He did, however, praise 3 people who had been jailed for obstructing the draft. Furthermore, the Socialist Party had recently adopted a resolution called for, quote, "continuous, active, and public opposition to the war through demonstrations, mass petitions, and all other means within our power," unquote. Federal agents who had been shadowing Debs wrote down his words. Debs was arrested, tried, and convicted of violating the Espionage Act of 1917. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Debs' lawyers appealed to the Supreme Court by arguing he had a right to free speech, and in any case, he hadn't advised anyone to desert or resist conscription. Writing for a unanimous court, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. disagreed. He said, quote, "Even though Debs did not explicitly tell his listeners to avoid the draft, that was the basic idea of his talk. He created a clear and present danger to a country at war. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in times of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterances will not be endured so long as men fight," unquote. World War I ended on November 11th, 1918. The decision in Debs v. United States was handed down in 1919. Debs appealed to President Wilson, but Wilson thought Debs was a traitor to his country and he would never be pardoned during his administration. In 1920, Debs ran for the presidency for the fifth time, although this was during the time he was in prison. Again, more than 900,000 people voted for him. The winner of that election was Warren G. Harding. On Christmas Day in 1921, he freed Debs and invited him to the White House. This example shows that when the United States was at war, American citizens' civil rights, especially free speech, were pretty much restricted because the government did not want any disloyalty among them and went against citizens speaking out against them. But what part of the Constitution gives the federal government the authority to do this during emergencies? When the framers gathered to write a new constitution, they were already breaking the rules. They thought only limited revisions to the Articles of Confederation were supposed to be made, but they knew the fate of the country was at stake. In certain seasons of public danger, they thought it was commendable to exceed power. By mid-September 1787, they were ready to put the finishing touches on their constitutional handwork, but what about a Bill of Rights? Most states guaranteed fundamental rights like religion and speech. Should the federal government do so too? Some framers did not think a Bill of Rights was worth it since a list like that is not worth the paper it is written on. They were already creating a government with limited power, so they did not want to bother to tell people they had a right if officials were limited from taking their right away from them. They thought it was simply understood. During the ratification process, however, the public disagreed. They wanted to have their rights guaranteed, and they would not ratify the Constitution without it. Madison was convinced. After he was elected a representative from Virginia in the first U.S. Congress, he became the chief draftsman of the Bill of Rights. Originally, 12 amendments were submitted to the states for ratification, but only amendments 3 through 12 were ratified by 1791. What turned into the First Amendment, originally it was a third, opens powerfully and without compromise, quote, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech," unquote. If that is the case, how could Congress pass the Espionage Act of 1917? The framers disobeyed rules, and the country was founded on a revolution. After all, perhaps future members of Congress believed they could destroy the Constitution's rules as well. In 1798, just 7 years after the Bill of Rights was adopted, Congress passed a Sedition Act while America was involved in a quasi-war of naval incidents against France. Leaders at the time responded that the Constitution allowed Congress to bar sedition as it was seen as a threat to the domestic tranquility promised in the preamble. But Thomas Jefferson believed the act was unconstitutional. When he became president, he pardoned those who remained in prison. With all of this in mind, do we lose our rights when the president and Congress agree that our country is threatened? Here's where the problem comes in. The Constitution barely addresses its emergency powers, which is the additional authority that the government might assume during a time of crisis. But apparently, what you thought was freedom of speech, the US government thought was unlawful. Similar concerns about national security arose when America entered World War II in 1941. 2 months after Japanese aircraft bombed Pearl Harbor, a US military base in Hawaii. President Franklin D. Roosevelt banned all Americans of Japanese ancestry from living in a large section of the western United States. FDR feared they would be more loyal to the country of their forefathers than to the country in which they live. The military rounded up more than 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry and confined them in internment camps so miserable that Justice Owen Roberts called them concentration camps. One Japanese American, Fred Korematsu, refused to follow orders. He appealed to the Supreme Court, but the majority ruled against him. Apparently, during wartime, it was more important to prevent possible threats to national security than to allow individuals their right to freedom. So, people like Korematsu were being discriminated against and detained during the war, all because the federal government was nervous that someone in the United States with Japanese ethnicity would automatically be loyal to Japan, which the US saw as an enemy at that time. The issue was that there seemed to be less ways to stop the federal government from using fears as an excuse to restrict people's civil rights and go after a specific ethnic group of individuals. Remember, when we act on our fears, we do not always think rationally, and we can unnecessarily hurt others in the process, just like Korematsu. In a crisis where we should be careful about how we act around each other, We instead have the door open to use fears as an excuse to act irrationally. The framers defined danger as being under attack. Today, we understand that peril can take many forms: technological, medical, biological, and environmental. How much does the Constitution control the decisions the government can make when we face a crisis? The Constitution needs to be amended to define more clearly when the country faces a true emergency and what the government can and cannot do. Otherwise, the federal government can possibly use any sort of danger and say it is severe enough to limit people's civil rights and become overpowered. Let's take a look at how other systems of governments handle such crises. States often declare a state of emergency after a natural disaster or during significant civil unrest. This allows for temporarily suspending citizens' ordinary rights, like imposing a curfew, for example. But by the mid 20th century, courts agreed that there is no such thing as sedition or treason against a state, the way there is against a country. In other countries, war is the fundamental stress test for any democratic constitution. Leaders are tempted to take control and shut the people out of the process. Citizens clamor to be protected from enemies, yet they also want their freedoms protected. The constitutions of 178 countries address emergency powers, which give the head of state the ability to suspend all or some of the people's rights. 46 European countries have signed on to the European Convention on Human Rights, which protects fundamental rights in politics in more detail than the Bill of Rights. In 1988, Congress passed a Civil Liberties Act, which President Ronald Reagan signed into law. The act finally apologized for the displacement and detention of Japanese Americans and gave $20,000 to every person who had been displaced. President Bill Clinton bestowed the Presidential Medal of Korematsu in 1998. In 2011, California established January 30th as the annual Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution. Hawaii, Virginia, and Florida have since passed legislative bills recognizing Fred Korematsu Day, and multiple other states have submitted resolutions and bills to do the same. At the end of the day, we still need to provide clarity in the Constitution on how the federal government can and cannot interact with people when specific kinds of emergencies happen, so our freedoms are being protected and civility is being maintained. In conclusion, the use of emergency powers has repeatedly tested the balance between national security and freedom. Based on the examples I talked about, those moments reveal how fear and crisis can lead the federal government to restrict civil rights in the name of protecting the nation. Despite instances of freedom being restricted, like Debs and Korematsu, they have been upheld at those times because it was justified as necessary to preserve stability in times of danger. Even though those two instances got some reconciliation, it still left lasting marks in their lives and everyone else who had their freedoms limited during those times. The Constitution's vagueness on the specific limits of emergency powers has created a gray area where it allows the government to expand its authority in ways that may conflict with citizens' rights. History shows that in moments of crisis, the temptation to prioritize control over freedom can lead to injustice. These types of moments remind us that safeguarding the Constitution means ensuring that even in emergencies, people in power must remain accountable and freedoms must be protected. As threats evolve, whether they are wars, pandemics, or environmental disasters, the need to clearly define the government's authority during emergencies becomes ever more important. Amending the Constitution that outlines when and how emergency powers can be used would help preserve both national stability and individual rights whenever difficult moments happen in our country. In the next video, we will look at habeas corpus. Until then, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and turn on the post notifications so you will be notified when I post my next video. I appreciate your support. Remember, you are powerful, you are capable, and you are the changemaker our society needs. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you soon.